revisit something before we go anywhere new. Episode 1, a partner who asks where you were, who had a note for everything, and slowly, over years, made your world smaller and quieter and more about managing their reactions. And somewhere in that episode, I said something that I want to come back to now. I said that the person building the cage doesn't always know they're building one, that some of them are afraid, and some of them are replicating something that was done to them, and that some of them really believe the questions and the monitoring and the control are love. Episode 2, a group that gave people real belonging, community, purpose, real answers in a world that felt chaotic and impossible to navigate. And the people who built those groups, at least in the beginning, at least some of them, started with something they believed in, a vision of something better before the fear set in and the control became the point. Episode 3, clinicians who got it wrong, who labeled the wrong person and misread symptoms through the lens of a bias they didn't know they carried, who genuinely thought they were helping, who went home believing they'd done good work. Episode 4, engineers who designed full to refresh and didn't fully understand what they were building. Companies who deployed AI companions to teenagers were optimizing for retention. Algorithms nobody programmed to radicalize anyone, just systems that learned what engagement like and chased it. Every single episode this season, every single cage, and in almost everyone, when you look closely enough at the people who built it, you find the same uncomfortable thing. They mostly thought they were doing something good. That's what I want to sit in today because I think it's the hardest thing about this season and the thing that makes everything we've talked about difficult to act on. It's easy to protect yourself from a villain. A villain announces themselves, gives you something to point to, and the story is clean. What do you do when the cage was built by someone who loved you? When the institution that failed you genuinely believed in its mission? When the system that reshaped your perception of reality was just trying to keep you engaged? What do you do when nobody meant to hurt you? You got hurt anyway. I'm Dr. Nika. This is the final episode of season 2 of Dominion here. And today we're closing the cage door one last time and looking directly at what's inside. Let me start with something that I think is deeply human and problematic at the same time. When we get hurt, we need a story, a narrative that makes sense of pain. And the most satisfying narrative, the one that gives the pain a clear address and that lets you know where to put your anger, is the one with a villain. The villain explains everything. The partner who was controlling was a narcissist. The group that took years of your life was run by a predator. The doctor who misdiagnosed you was negligent or biased. The company that hooked your kid on an AI app was reckless and greedy. The villain gives you a target, and targeting is easier than reckoning. Psychologists have actually studied this. Research published in the journal Psychological Science found something that is obvious when you see it, but genuinely unsettling. People constantly judge identical harms as worse when they're perceived as intentional versus accidental. Two people experienced the same damage. One was caused deliberately, one wasn't. People report the intentional harm as significantly more severe, recommend harsher punishment, and remember it with more anger, even when the actual damage is physically identical. Intentional harm feels worse. Unintentional harm of equal magnitude gets less attention, response, and the implication of that research is quite devastating. If most of the systems causing harm don't have malicious intent behind them, and if required to respond proportionally to perceived intent rather than actual damage, then the most damaging systems in the world can run almost untouched because nobody's directing outrage at an algorithm, or nobody's angry at the psychiatric diagnostic manual, or filing lawsuits against the confirmation bias. We save our outrage for the villains and the system that do most damage in quiet, ordinary, unintentionally ways keep running. That's a problem. And it's a problem that requires understanding something that Arendt understood and Milgram understood. And most of us resist deeply. In 1961, a philosopher named Hannah Arendt traveled to Jerusalem to cover a trial for the New Yorker. The trial was of Adolf Eichmann, one of the key architects of the Holocaust logic. Arendt wasn't expecting to encounter a monster, fanatic, something that looked evil in the way we imagine evil looks. What she found instead was a man who spoke almost entirely in cliches, who couldn't form an original thought and referred to his work in administrative language, who described organizing the deportation of millions of people to death camps using the vocabulary of office management. And Arendt wrote about what she saw in terms that made the world deeply uncomfortable. He called it the banality of evil. And what she meant by that wasn't that the evil was trivial. She meant that the mode of its production was ordinary, not demonic or driven by hatred, driven by something almost worse, by a man who had simply stopped thinking about what he was doing, who had, as she put it, an authentic inability to think from anyone else's perspective. Eichmann wasn't evil the way we want evil to look. He was evil the way evil usually actually functions through systems and through roles, through the diffusion of responsibility across enough people that no single one of them has to hold the full weight of what they're collective. A year after Aikman's trial, a psychologist at Yale named Stanley Milgram ran an experiment that looked, on its surface, like it was about learning and memory. Participants were told to play the role of teacher, administering electric shock to a learner in the next room when they got answers wrong. The shocks escalated with each wrong answer. The learner, who was an actor, cried out, begged for the experiment to stop, eventually fell silent. 65% of participants went to the maximum voltage. It wasn't because they wanted to or sadistic. It was because a man in a white coat kept saying, the experiment requires that you continue, because the situation was set up to make obedience feel like the reasonable, responsible choice. And because the authority was legitimate and the escalation was gradual, the responsibility felt diffused across the setup rather than located in any single person. Ordinary people inflicting what they believed was serious harm because the system told them to, and the system felt legitimate. They couldn't find the moment where stopping was clearly the right thing to do. Milgram said something afterward that has stayed with me since I first read it in grad school. He said, often it is not so much the kind of person as the kind of situation which he finds himself that determines how he will act, not character, situation. The situation determines behavior more than character does. And the situations we've been talking about all season, the controlling relationship, high control group, psychiatric institution, the digital environment, are all powerful situations. They're systems that were specifically built to produce particular behaviors, the people inside them. And those systems produce those behaviors whether or not anyone inside them is a villain. Let me come back to episode one, the coercive control episode. I want to tell you something I don't think I said clearly enough there. Research on people who perpetrate coercive control finds that a significant portion of them have their own history of trauma, their own experience of powerlessness, and nervous system that learned somewhere early that relationships were unsafe. And then control was how you kept the thing you needed leaving. That isn't an excuse. I want to be completely clear. It's not an excuse. The cage is the cage. The damage is the damage. A person's history doesn't make their behavior okay or tolerable or something you need to accommodate. The people in these relationships have every right to leave or to be angry, name what was done to them as abuse. But it does mean something for understanding, because understanding isn't the same as forgiving. And understanding is what allows us to see the pattern clearly enough to break it, then just survive it. A person who is controlled learns that control is what love looks like. They move through the world with their nervous system calibrated to threat, looking for signs that the people they love are about to leave or betray them. And they reach for the tools experience taught them, the monitoring, the restrictions, slow narrowing of others' person's world. And as I said, they're not evil. It's because they're mostly always terrified. And because nobody ever showed them a different way to manage terror. That terror produces real harm to the person they're with, documented, serious, lasting harm. And the terror doesn't justify the harm. Both of those things are true at the same time, and holding both of them is harder than having a villain. The question for the survivor isn't, was this person a monster? That question doesn't change anything. The question always is, does this open from the inside? And if the answer is no, then the history of the person who built the cage is interesting, but not determinative. The cage is still the cage, and you still deserve to walk out of it. Episode 2, The Cult. I want to go back to Jim Jones for a second, because I think the easy version of that episode lets people follow Jones under obvious monster and move on. He's more complicated than that, and the complication matters. Jones started in the 1950s preaching racial integration in American men. That wasn't a safe or comfortable thing to do. He was standing up for something real at real personal cost. People who came to his church came because they found something they needed and weren't getting it elsewhere. Belonging, dignity, community across racial lines, the sense that their lives had meaning and purpose within a larger movement. Those things were real. Jones provided them genuinely for years. And then something started to shift. The paranoia, need for control, the fear that the government was watching, the defectors were enemies, outside world was closing in. Whether that was mental illness, genuine external threats, addiction to drugs he was consuming in increasing quantities, or all three, something happened to Jim Jones, and the group that had been built on something real became a vehicle for his unraveling. And by the end, by Jonestown, Jones wasn't a visionary. He was a man in the grip of something, afraid, paranoid, and pain, exercising the total control that the structure he'd built now gave him. And over 900 people died because they trusted a structure that had once been trustworthy. The tragedy of Jonestown isn't that an evil man gathered followers. The tragedy is that something real became something monstrous through a process that nobody inside could clearly see, including, at the beginning, Jones himself. That's what makes high control groups clinically important to understand. They don't start as cages, they start as communities. And the conditions under which communities become cages aren't always obvious from the inside. Fear is usually at the center. The leader's fear, the group's fear, and the fear of the outside world. The fear of losing what was built. And when fear drives the structure starts to contract, to protect itself, and demand more compliance, to narrow the world. The believers aren't stupid. They're inside something that was real and has been gradually replaced by something that uses the memory, what was real, to keep them in place. Episode 3, Psychiatric Institution. I've been in the field for years, and I want to tell you something that is difficult to say as a clinician. The gaps we talked about in episode 3, the racial disparities in diagnosis, the gendered misclassifications of trauma, institutional inertia that keeps diagnostics from catching up with what we understand about trauma and recovery. These aren't the results of evil clinicians. They're mostly not. They are the results of systems that were built at a historical moment by kind of person who is with particular blind spots and have huge institutional resistance being rebuilt from the ground up. I have seen clinicians who are dedicated, caring, and exhausted from trying to do right by their patients. And I've also watched those people make decisions that I know and they probably know somewhere are shaped by biases they haven't fully examined. And they're not bad people. We are all running on the same cognitive hardware, and that hardware has confirmation bias baked in. The system we're working inside doesn't give us nearly enough time, support, or training to interrupt it. That's a systematic problem. And systematic problems are the hardest kind to fix because you can't fire your way out of them. You can't blame your way out of them. You can't even train your way out of them entirely. You have to change the architecture, and changing the architecture of a system as large and famous as American psychiatry is a generational project that nobody involved is in a position to complete on their own. The Rosenhan experiment from 1973 is still being discussed and debated in 2026. The DSM still doesn't have complex PTSD in its main text. The racial disparities in diagnosis that Jonathan Metzl documented in the 1960s are documented again, current data, almost unchanged in some respects. The system knows about these problems. The individual people inside it mostly care about them, and the architecture moves slowly. The people who are harmed by the gaps don't get to wait for the architecture to move. They need help now inside a system that is imperfect in ways that aren't accidental and not anyone's individual fault and not easily fixed. That's where I land, trying to do good inside a system I know is flawed, trying to interrupt my own biases without being able to fully see them. And I try to give my patients something real inside a diagnostic framework that I know has real limitations. Most of psychologists are doing the same thing. And the institution as a whole is still producing the outcomes we talked about in episode 3. Both of those things are true at the same time. Episode 4, the algorithm, the app, the AI companion. I want to say something about the engineers and the people who built these systems because I think the character AI case in particular puts us in a position where it's tempting to find the responsible party and direct all anger there. When the 14-year-old boy passed away, his mother filed a lawsuit. Google character AI agreed to settlements. The system responded, and all of that is appropriate. Legal accountability matters. Corporate responsibility matters. The financial incentives that pushed AI companion companies to deploy untested, unregulated emotional manipulation technology to minors need to be interrogated and constrained. And also, the individual engineers who wrote the code, the product managers who spec the engagement features, the designers who chose the interaction patterns, most of them were doing their jobs, optimizing for the metrics they were given, working inside a system that valued retention and engagement and growth, not sitting in rooms deciding to harm children. The harm was real. The intention wasn't. The intention was build something people will use. And the gap between those two things, between the intention and the outcome, is where the most interesting and most important psychological question lives. Because what Arendt saw in Eichmann was not evil, it was in the absence of thinking, suspension of the moral faculty that would have required him to hold the full weight of what he was producing, the role in the system, and the gradual escalation and the diffusion of responsibility all conspired to make it possible to do enormous damage without ever having to look at the damage directly. That's exactly what happened with algorithmic systems and AI companies. Not one single person looked at a child and decided to harm them. A set of incentive structures optimized by a set of systems run by a set of people, each doing their individual reasonable jobs, produced conditions in which people were harmed. And the harm happened gradually. And the people inside the system didn't have a clear moment where stopping was obviously the right thing to do. They had metrics and roadmaps and quarterly targets. Hannah Arendt's word was thoughtfulness. the failure to think about what you're actually producing, not stupidity or indifference. The specific suspension of the imaginative faculty that would require you to stand in the position of the person your decision lands on. That's the architecture of systemic harm, and it runs at every scale we've talked about this season. I want to talk about what it does to a person to sit with this. Because I've been doing this work for years and I've across from people who are trying to make sense of what was done to them. And the hardest ones are never the ones where someone clearly meant harm. The hardest ones are the people who knew intellectually that their parents didn't mean to damage them, who understand that the controlling partner was maybe terrified, who've been told by a therapist that the group they were in used tactics that the leader may not have fully understood were destructive, and who can see clearly that the system that failed them was operating with limited tools and who still got hurt and are trying to figure out what to do with the hurt. There's no clean target for it. Here's what I've come to believe. Working with people in those situations, absence of malicious intent doesn't change what happened to you. It doesn't reduce the reality of the damage. It doesn't mean you owe anyone forgiveness or understanding or grace. You can understand the psychology, how someone built a cage around you and still be completely angry about the cage. Understanding and forgiving aren't the same thing. Understanding and excusing aren't the same thing. What understanding does, and what I think it's actually for clinically, is it allows you to see the cage as a cage, then as a shape of reality. Because one of the things that sustained systematic control does to people is it gets internalized. The lens through which the controlling partner saw you starts to feel like how you actually are. The framework the group gave you for understanding the world starts to feel like the only real framework. The label the institution put on you starts to feel like who you are, and the worldview algorithm assembled for you starts to feel like what reality looks like. Understanding that all of those were constructed, that they were produced by systems with specific limits and motives, is what makes it possible to deconstruct them. To step back and say, this is the thing that was done to me. This is not who I am. This isn't how the world works. This is what a particular system operating with its own logic produced inside me. And I can examine it, choose to keep the parts that are actually mine, and release the parts that aren't. That's what recovery looks like at its core. Across all of these contexts, across the abusive relationships, the high control group, and the institutional failure, digital environments, the rebuilding of the self that can tell the difference what was done to it, what it actually is. Research on trauma recovery is consistent on what the process requires, not understanding alone or the ability to explain what happened to you. Connection, real human connection, people who know you and are separate from the system that harmed you. The ability to make choices, small ones first, that feel like yours, and then the gradual reconstruction of the sense that your perceptions are trustworthy, that your judgment is something you can rely on, and the world contains safe relationships. The last part is the hardest for people who've been inside multiple systems. You've been controlled in a relationship and then felt failed by a mental health system, and then watched their online community become something they didn't recognize, who've had their vision of what's safe repeatedly disrupted, and come to the reasonable conclusion that all systems are cages and all closeness is control, and institutions are ultimately designed to serve themselves. I understand that conclusion. I watched people arrive at it through completely logical reasoning from their actual experience. And I think it's the most of the damaging places a person can end up because it's a conclusion that effectively builds the final, most penetrable cage of all, the one that's inside your own head, the one that protects you from everything, including the connections that could help. 4 episodes, 4 cages. one question running through all of them. Does this open from the inside? I'm going to close this session with a slightly different version of that question because I don't think the goal is just being able to leave things. That's survival. That's getting out, and getting out is necessary, but it's not sufficient. The fuller question is, does your life open from the inside? Are you making choices that feel like yours? Do you have relationships where you're allowed to be complicated and wrong, changing, and not yet figured out? And the relationship holds? Do you have a sense of your own perceptions that you trust, at least enough to navigate by? Do you have places where you belong that don't require you to disappear? Can you be uncertain? Can you be wrong? Change your mind without losing everything? Can you question the groups you're in, the systems you're inside, the relationships you're in, and have that questioning perceived as something other than a threat? Can you name what you actually feel than what the environment has trained you to feel? These are all the signs I look for clinically, not the absence of difficulty or pain or complication. It's the presence of that important thing, the sense that you're the author of your own interior life, that what you think and feel and believe is actually yours, and that you came to it, at least in part, through your own experience or your own reasoning and your own sense of what's true, not just through what someone else built inside you. That's the opposite of every cage we talked about this season. Every cage was a system that took authorship of that interior life away through love, fear, authority, algorithm, the construction of a world where your own visions couldn't be trusted and the only reliable truth came from outside you. The recovery in every case is the same as its core, not the dramatic escape, the gradual, difficult, sometimes hard work of finding out what you actually think, what you actually feel, who you actually are when the system stops deciding that. I've been thinking about what to say at the end of this season for a while because I don't want to do the thing where I tie it up too cleanly, where I hand you a framework and say, there you go. Now you understand control, send you off feeling like you've been brushed off because I don't think you have. I'm someone who understands these in detail, and I'm not immune to them. Nobody is. The system works on the people who understand them. That's how powerful underlying needs are: the need to belong, for certainty, the need to be understood and feel like what you're doing matters. These needs aren't weaknesses, they're the most important thing about being human. And they are the exact things that every cage we've discussed exploits. What I hope this season gave you isn't immunity, it's vocabulary, the ability to name what's happening when it's happening. Because named things are different from unnamed things. Controlling relationship that you have no language for is just your life, just difficult, or the way things are. Controlling relationship that you can see through the lens of coercive control, something that you can examine, something you can make a decision about. A group that makes you feel chosen and understood and like finally you found your people is, until you know the mechanics, just a group. The same group understood through the bite model, something you can interrogate. You can ask, can I leave? What happens if I question? What would happen if I stop attending? Not to make yourself paranoid, it's to find out if there's a door. A psychiatric label that feels like the truth of who you are is just who you are until you know that labels carry history and bias and institutional momentum. Then it's something you can ask a second opinion about, some even third, something you can situate in a larger story and decide how much authority to give it. A feed that feels like reality is just reality until you know that it's been curated by a system optimizing for your engagement. Then it's something you could look at sideways, something you can disrupt and catch yourself inside of and ask, is this what I actually think? Or is this what 6 months of algorithm has chosen for me? None of those moves are easy. They're all harder than just living inside the system. They require you to look at things that feel like the truth and ask if they actually are. That's uncomfortable work. It's not one time work. It's the ongoing practice of being a person who thinks about where they're thinking from. That's the move, not the dramatic exit or the aha moment. The ongoing, quiet, sometimes boring practice of asking, does this open from the inside? Nobody meant to hurt you. Sometimes, and I mean not all relationships, I'm talking about the coercive partner, didn't mean to hurt you. Your partner was afraid. The group was built on something real. The clinician was working with limited tools inside a system with limits you didn't build and they didn't build. The app was optimizing for a metric. The algorithm was doing its job, and you got hurt anyway. The hurt is real. It has a right to exist, regardless of whether anyone intended it. Both of those things are true, and the hardest work, the work this whole season has been circling, is learning to hold both of them without collapsing into each other, without needing the villain so badly that you can't see the system, without excusing the system so cruelly that you can't name what was done to you. The cage was real. You didn't imagine it. You didn't deserve it. And you didn't cause it. It was built by the people who were mostly doing what their fear or training or their own damage told them to do in a world that mostly doesn't have good enough language for what it's producing. In a culture that's only beginning to ask whether the ordinary systems of daily life, the relationships and communities and institutions, apps, all of them that are supposed to support human flourishing are actually doing that. We're asking now. That's something. That's what this season was. The question, the only one that finally matters, the one I want you to carry out of this season into what comes next, does your life open from the inside? If yes, protect it. Tend to it. Don't take it for granted. The relationship and communities and spaces where you actually get to be the author of what's true. If no, then you know where to start. Not with a dramatic exit, with the small question. The one that begins in the gap between what someone else built inside you and what you find when you look for what's actually yours. The gap is where everything begins. It's small, it's real, and it's always the first door. Thank you for being here. Comment. Tell me what you think. I'll see you in season 3.